Welcome to the Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and today we're diving into MK, the armed wing of the ANC, and of course, Nelson Mandela. To break it all down, we're joined by Professor Thula Simpson, an award-winning author and expert on this history. Thula, great to have you on the show. What made you focus your research on MK, and how did you first get into this field?
Thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to it. I started research on MK in 2001 when I was looking for a PhD topic. And it was around the time, as I recall now, of the 9/11 bombings, of course, or the attacks. And what I was looking for is a subject which could maintain its relevance. MK was actually not my first choice. I was so looking for something which could be relevant to the passing incidents at the time, is that I also experimented with a topic on globalization, and then also one on the military journalism of Leon Trotsky. So I was quite a freelancer as far as that was concerned, but I had a supervisor lined up in Hilary Sapphire at Birkbeck College, and she's a South African specialist, so we looked for a South African topic. And MK was actually my second one. The first one was to think about doing a thesis on the township uprising of the 1980s and its comparisons to the radical phase of the French Revolution. Now, why this long roundabout journey to MK might be interesting and important in terms of my personal biography is that we were not divorced from the struggle. I was born in Swaziland and we lived there for 8 years. And we were not central to the struggle, but sufficiently in the periphery for details of my family to come up sporadically in military intelligence archives of the South African security services. We went from Swaziland to Britain in 1988, basically as refugees, created by the liberation struggle. So to put it mildly, I was ambivalent about South Africa and its struggles, and that's possibly one of the reasons why it took a while for me to get to the ANC's armed struggle. And that when I got there, the thesis that I chose to do was very bird's eye. It was about the strategy and tactics of the ANC rather than what's going on at ground level. It took a while for me to actually get into the blood and the muck of what's going on at ground level. My thesis was very strategy and tactics on the People's War of uMkhonto, weSizwe. So as far as I can reconcile in my own mind what was motivating me, those were some of the factors which were involved at the time.
Thanks so much for that, Thula. And I'm a fan of your work. I think I bought your book. It came out, maybe, was it 2015? 15 or 16?
2016, January, February, yeah.
Yeah, as I remember, I was based in Pretoria then, and Everett and I went to go and grab a coffee. We were like, yeah, we want to read it. And it was pretty cool. We can come back to it later. But I remember just reading the intro and the first thing you do and just breaking it open. And you wrote it in the present tense. And it just kind of keeps you going, like you're there all the time. And that was pretty smart, man.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. That was just like a random comment, without a question. So I'm going to just, off what you were saying right now, could you give our listeners, because for yourself, for others, it might be, very prominent, but could you give our listeners a little bit of background about Nelson Mandela and perhaps just how he linked in with the MK?
Well, he is the founder of modern South Africa in the sense that, as they said of Washington, the first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of the nation. And Nelson Mandela really was that. I think that's what people sometimes forget in the sort of popular portrayal of Mandela, which biographers for many years have been trying to remind them, is that the early Mandela, the pre-prison Mandela, was actually the leader of the radical faction of the ANC in many respects. I mean, when the ANC moves from being a petitioning to a mass protest organization with the Defiance Campaign of 1952, he's the volunteer in chief. But then he's also the first person to start leading initiatives to say that nonviolence is not going to work against a regime such as this. And so he starts initiating from 1953 attempts to start discussions about armed struggle. And then he becomes the commander-in-chief of uMkhonto, weSizwe. So that's the young Mandela, the radical Mandela. The Mandela who builds sufficient struggle credentials in terms of his radicalism for him to be able to prevail once he comes out of prison, a path of moderation as far as his colleagues are concerned. So there's very much a distinction between the early Mandela and the later Mandela as we remember him and the sort of iconic figure that he's subsequently assumed.
Yeah. And iconic is the right word. I don't think there is anyone in the world who doesn't know Nelson Mandela. But the version of him most people recognize, I would believe, is the later Mandela, the statesman, the reconciler. That's the image we've been given globally. But what you're saying and what tends to be forgotten is just how radical he was before prison.
Max, and I can cut in there before you go ahead with your question. And until I know you're the main guest, you're like, oh God, these guys are just talking between themselves. But I wanted to mention, I had the same experience, I'm 43, turning 44, of a certain generation. And I think the same for yourself, Max, and Thula, similar. I had a conversation with someone a while back about the same age that was in the United States. And they said, when I mentioned that, I was South African, I am South African, even though my dad's Spanish and my name's a little bit confusing. And then he says to me, a great South African, the best South African ever. Do you know who that is? And I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I know. And he says, yep, Elon Musk, he's the best. And I was like, you gotta be shitting me, man. I was like, you know about Nelson Mandela? And he was like, so sorry. I hear you, Max. I didn't mean for that to be a counterpoint, but I just feel like, there's different worlds over here, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. It's like we're in this new Musk world now. I don't even think about him as South African, to be honest. But it's crazy to think that there is a whole generation out there that might not even connect South Africa with Mandela first.
And David Sachs and Peter Thiel. I keep hearing that there's a sort of cabal of South Africans who are driving the MAGA world insane with regards to how they have managed to influence the incoming administration with their big tech money.
In a few days, I think we're going to see that play out in a few days.
Yeah, just wait for, 5 days, and we'll see what happens. But Thula, I want to get back to Mandela's transition. His transition from the radical activist to the statesman. How do we connect his early militant views with the later peaceful approach? And how did his engagement with the armed struggle shape the leader he eventually became?
1952 is a very important year because in 1949, the ANC had agreed a program of action which was saying that we need now to move to mass action to support our new slogans of African nationalism. 1952 is the first demonstration of this new policy. It's called the Defiance Campaign. But mass action is met with mass arrest. And as I mentioned earlier, Mandela was the volunteer in chief. What we know now is that in 1953, Nelson Mandela, when he hears that his friend Walter Sisulu has been invited to attend a student conference in Bucharest in Romania, he asks him whilst he's abroad to go to China and see whether China will support an armed struggle. Sisulu does that. He comes back and says that the Chinese brushed him off because he hadn't thought about it very thoroughly. But that's the seeding of the discussion about armed struggle as far as Mandela is concerned, because the response to the Defiance Campaign, where thousands of demonstrators were arrested, and then you had the introduction of tough security laws early the following year, providing for states of emergency in the future and increasingly harsh sentencing. That leads him to think that ultimately there cannot be a peaceful resolution with this regime. And the idea stays there. And what happens is that there's the catalyst of the Sharpeville massacre in March 1960 and the banning of the ANC 18 days later, which leads to increasing numbers of people saying that we need to foster this discussion. And that's what leads to the formation of uMkhonto weSizwe in in the second half of 1961, with the launch in December 1961.
It sounds like the ANC's approach to resistance was already evolving in the 1950s, not just in strategy, but in rhetoric too. Was there already a sense at that time that non-violent resistance wasn't going to be enough? And was this shift towards militancy something openly discussed, or was it more of an undercurrent before events like Sharpeville pushed it forward?
It's very much the language. It's sort of hybrid moment as far as nonviolence is concerned. There's an argument which, as far as I know, only Elena Darabji, who she wrote a thesis of all places, in the University of California system in the 1970s, she pointed out that people speak of South African nonviolence and Gandhianism, but then there's a significant difference between Gandhian passive resistance of the early 20th century as pioneered in South Africa and what the ANC is doing in the 1950s. What you see in the 1950s is that the ANC starts pioneering terms like making South Africa unworkable and ungovernable. That's not soul force. It's not spiritual conversion. It's using the force of numbers to cause economic crisis and collapse through strikes, demonstrations, non-cooperation. It's a sort of attempt to use numbers to compel change. What is significant about that is that it's not purely Gandhian nonviolence. It's a development of it. And that's the kind of rhetoric that they're using. And that kind of militancy is all over the place, because whilst people speak about the protests of the 1950s as being purely nonviolent, there's an extraordinary archive which is actually developed as a result of police repression. Because what the police do after the Defiance campaign is they start getting police constables to go and attend these ANC meetings. And they make themselves conspicuous, the white man in the crowd, making sure he's taking notes of everybody as a sort of intimidatory tactic. But they write down what's actually being said there. What's being said there is they're not paeans to nonviolence. What's taking place there is people praising Mau Mau and Dien Bien Phu and the Korean Revolution and all of these other contemporary examples of people in the global south taking up arms and fighting for their liberation. This is actually what informs what will become the treason trial. There's a sort of hazy sense in much of the literature to think of this as being in some way trumped up and the government trying to clamp down without reason on the opposition movement. What the government is doing is that they can tell something is up based on the tone of these speeches, people praising violence and these sort of incendiary mode. It's clearly not Gandhianism with the celebration of violence that's going on. And we know now that if the South African state in the 50s knew what we know now, which is basically that conspiracy had been launched to actually try and start armed struggle by Mandela sending Sisulu to China to start that discussion, they would have got a guilty verdict. And of course, irony upon irony, when they're acquitted in March 1961, the decision has already been made by the ANC underground after the Sharpeville massacre during that underground phase. They have become guilty of what they've been acquitted of, because by then they've said, let's start an attempt to create an underground armed struggle. So the treason trial was an attempt to take the Freedom Charter, which was the ANC's manifesto for a post-apartheid South Africa, and all of these speeches which are being said at these various forums, and make a case that they're trying to incite the masses for an armed revolution. It doesn't quite work, because just because people are praising Dien Bien Phu on a podium in some Sophia town soapbox, it doesn't mean that there's a conspiracy for revolution, but they can feel something in the air taking place. And their instincts were right, but they didn't have the evidence to be able to get clinching conviction.
That's interesting. There's also a particular cultural moment, sort of 50s, 60s, and I think African consciousness is developing in South Africa at the time. And it makes sense, and I find that fascinating, the way that you've explained it. And then as we have, let's say, MK forming and sort of developing, what was Nelson Mandela's role in and his leadership in terms of developing their strategies?
He had that voyage where Sisulu went to China, and he hadn't a very clear idea of what this armed struggle would manifest itself as. After they decided to send groups to receive training abroad, China is one of the first countries which they went to. China, in a sense, is the most important Asian revolution. It transforms that continent, and it's a victory by armed struggle. And they look upon China as being potentially a country which will have an armed struggle similar to the South African one. Then there's a very interesting section in Andrew Mlangeni's autobiography, where he speaks about actually meeting Chairman Mao in Tiananmen Square. And he basically says, from what you're describing with South Africa, it's an industrial, urbanized country. It doesn't have many comparisons with China at the time, was underdeveloped and rural. He said maybe going to Algeria and speaking about that would be best with regards to the contemporary struggle which is going there. So the Chinese one doesn't quite work as far as the ANC is concerned. When Mandela leaves South Africa just weeks after MK is launched, he goes on a tour in Africa to mobilize support. And part of his itinerary takes him to Algeria, and he pitches his ideas. And what he says there, according to the account that's been relayed to us, is that he goes there with the idea of the Cuban Revolution, of the Sierra Maestras, that being a potential model which they could say. But then the Algerians say, look, where would your mountains be? The only mountain range where you could ensconce yourself would be in Lesotho, which is right in the belly of the beast. I mean, it's literally the only completely landlocked country, as we all know. So that won't work either. So they sort of put him on a different model. So in a sense, they're very much taking the Napoleonic dictum of first engage, then see. You know, there's this idea that nonviolence won't work. We need to take up armed struggle. And whilst people say the armed struggle failed, that can only work if the ANC had a very fixed idea, which they pursued resolutely, and it ended up as being a disaster. It was very much the idea that we need to take up arms. Once we've taken up arms, we need to be flexible, engage in discussions, and just work out what the form this will take in South Africa. What will that be? And the very interesting thing about the first phases of ANC's armed struggle is that they fly a variety of kites, seeing as to what a South African armed struggle might be. But then, you know, none of them are ideal, and eventually have to work out their own model.
It sounds like the ANC wasn't really following a fixed blueprint, but like they were testing different ideas, taking influence from various revolutions while figuring out what would actually work in South Africa. And given all these different models being considered, what did Mandela personally see as the most realistic path forward at the time?
There wasn't a rigid monolithic vision. I think that would be my fundamental point, that there was a very much an idea that pure nonviolence hasn't worked. It's reached the end of the road. It's affecting the ANC politically within South Africa in terms of the willingness of people to support nonviolent demonstrations, because that had been the focus of the ANC's policy, and people are getting demoralized. So there's this idea that we need to move to a next stage. But then there's all sorts of discussion about what exactly that should be. So, for example, after Mandela is arrested, his colleagues develop a variant of Che Guevara's ideas of the Cuban Revolution, and there's huge dissension. That plan of Operation Mayabuya is never approved. So the idea that there is a need for violence is something which is not just limited to the ANC. You've got to also remember that there are alternative groups such as POCO, which is the name for the Pan-Africanist Congress Underground. And there's also a group which will be known as the African Resistance Movement. So a lot of activists are feeling frustrated and feeling that there's a need to take up arms. But there's no clear idea for what exactly that will be. I mean, take amongst other things, there's this classical notion of guerrilla warfare. One of them is rural sanctuaries. Nobody's ever thought through the idea of where those rural sanctuaries would be. There's an idea that we need to do this, but there's not clarity amongst, the straight line through to victory. Another one is if you've got a secure border, you can launch cross-border infiltrations. But at the time, all of South Africa's borders are by white minority-ruled states or very weak and intimidated African states. So there's no clear through line of this is the model that we're going to follow inflexibly and it will take us all the way to victory. I think the sense is much more that we've reached the end of the line as far as pure nonviolence is concerned. We need a shift of policy. And once they've decided that, then they start floating about what is this new stage of the struggle? What form is it going to take?
100%, Thula. And on that question that Max was alluding to, and your answer, which is very comprehensive. I feel when you read Nelson Mandela's autobiography, and of course it's written with hindsight, and he's got a certain narrative, and I feel it might be true that he doesn't take the decision lightly, and the pragmatism comes through. That this was a practical man. He's like, this is my objective. How do I get there? And that kind of thought of attacking economic targets. He seems, obviously I've never met him, I don't know him, but just looking at the sources and reading, you feel that he's measured and practical, and really he's got something, right? Like he's kind of savvy in this approach to the guerrilla warfare or to the armed struggle.
That's another important thing to remember, that the first phase, as you say, was a sabotage campaign, not into pure guerrilla warfare. And if you look at MK's founding manifesto, which they issued in the first day of operations, it's not saying that we envisage marching on Pretoria. It's saying that our first option would be to have a negotiated settlement, and we hope that our first actions will awake the Pretoria government to the danger of civil war, and it could actually forestall war. In other words, going to war to avoid war. And again, it follows on from my previous answer. It's not that they felt that, okay, this is definitely going to lead to negotiations and therefore, we don't have to do anything else. At the same time as they are running that sabotage campaign, Mandela goes into Africa, the rest of it, South Africa's part of Africa, let's move on. He goes to mobilize support for a further stage of struggle, should it be necessary. The turn to violence is loaded with a whole series of caveats and qualifications and let's do it and see provisionally if it works. If not, then we'll do that or the other. And I think that the interpretation of the armed struggle, its success and failure, must be viewed as that. And I think that, as all military historians would say, that's actually probably a very sound way of approaching it, because no plan survives the first engagement. You have to be willing to be flexible. And in that sense, they came into this with their heads screwed on the right way.
Quick pulse check. Are we on target? Drop a review on your app and hit subscribe on YouTube. Every click helps to keep the momentum going. Let's move ahead.
Yeah, I just can't stop thinking about what you had mentioned earlier. And I always say it when this discussion pops up. It's just the fundamental, I don't know if we even can measure the role of the people in South Africa with, go slow strikes and the actual strikes and that kind of, that unionist or the unions that mobilize its people. Because I think that had a massive impact on the economy and to spur on that kind of international response to especially towards in the 80s.
Well, they did in time. Look, I mean, one of the reasons why they launched the armed struggle, when they're speaking about popular disillusionment, let's read into our discussion the October 1960 referendum, where the South African government says whites have to close ranks, and to do that we need to have a republic of our own. And then there's the May 1961, that republic comes into being. And Mandela, again, leading the protest of the strike against it, he tries to launch a strike, and there's actually a very poor or limited public response to that. So they actually feel that the response to calls which they had in the early 1950s with things such as the Defiance Campaign, that's beginning to not have the same amount of resonance, because people are saying, you keep calling us to these nonviolent protests. We get criminal records, some of us get killed, we lose our jobs, nothing happens. And that is part of the climate where they feel they're losing their credibility as leaders. So they need to do something. What that thing is takes time to be clarified. And Mandela is arrested in August 1962, not having concluded definitively what that next phase is going to be. But there is that sense of crisis. It's a response to crisis, which is in the liberation movement. In a sense, it's a reaction to the aggressiveness of the South African state. It shouldn't be viewed as necessarily the ANC taking the initiative.
You mentioned Mandela's arrest. How did that actually unfold? And given that he had been underground for so long and had become South Africa's most wanted, what were the circumstances that finally led to him being caught? And looking further ahead, how did his arrest set the stage for the Rivonia trial and his own defense there?
Sure. I mean, he goes underground around the time that he's planning the anti-republic strike that I'm speaking of, which is the one in the build-up to South Africa becoming a republic in May 1961. And it's announced from the underground that he's the leader of the strike, so he becomes South Africa's most wanted. He becomes the Scarlet Pimpernel, the Black Pimpernel, the various names which his pursuers develop for him. Nobody finds any trace of him until he emerges in Addis Ababa, of all places, in February 1962, because he's left South Africa in January 1962, just days after MK is launched. So he reemerges in Addis Ababa in February 1962, and then he becomes South Africa's most wanted because he does an interview in Ethiopia where he says, "I shall return." So it's sort of like there are all sorts of sightings of him in various Soweto places, just weeks before they raid his home. Mandela's most wanted. He's going to return. The South African singer Johnny Clegg, his song is called Asimbonanga. Have you seen him? And that's very much what the situation was in 1962 when they were awaiting his return. They do get a tip-off. There's been talk for a long time that the CIA agent in South Africa alerted the Pretoria government to his whereabouts. That's never been definitively proved. But he is arrested in August the 5th, 1962, whilst on his way back from a meeting with the ANC's president and South Africa's first Nobel laureate, Peace Prize winner, Albert Luthuli, where they discussed his Africa trip abroad and the turn to violence, which they've agreed by then.
During the trial, I think it's an iconic moment in history because Nelson Mandela was famous before then, and you mentioned his escape and evasion before that, and sort of has this aura about him. But it's very much kind of localized, this fame at the time. The trial becomes, especially when he defends himself and his speech and coming in traditional way, it becomes an iconic moment that this man is, he has the hand of history on him. He's walking with history a little bit. Although maybe that's just us with hindsight putting that into perspective. But I'm not sure if that's kind of what you have through your research and what you found.
The profile of the struggle begins being transformed around the time of the decolonization of Africa. Let me put my thoughts together a bit more clearly. So by the time that you have the Rivonia trial, Albert Luthuli has won the Nobel Peace Prize. So the world is paying attention. And there's certain things which can't be ignored, such as that you've got this major war in Algeria, in the northern part of the continent. And the United Nations had got involved there. So there's very much the sense that this is something which is inevitably going to take place south of the Sahara. There is Mau Mau, of course, as well. There's the decolonization, the European powers fleeing. And so there's very much a sense that with South Africa being the most important country in sub-Saharan Africa in many ways, economically, military and otherwise, that it's a struggle that matters. And it's under Luthuli, just to give him his due as an important figure. It's under Luthuli where you start getting international correspondents showing up at ANC press conferences. There's this idea that in terms of the global situation, what happens in South Africa is important. So even before he does his statement from the dock, you did have representation from the British and American ambassadors. They were represented there. And they were very much saying that we're here to make sure that it's a fair trial. So I think he's a man in his times. And what those times are is it's a time of upheaval in Africa. And South Africa is understood to be an important country as far as that is concerned. Yes, his statement is very eloquent, but then just also to try and put him in, proper proportions. There are other African nationalist leaders who similarly, Nkrumah with his various writings, his classic books of Africanist historic, Kenyatta as well, even Hastings Banda, they've all had their moment in the dock, and they've all become Free Kenyatta, for example, as well, Secretary. So if he had been executed then, he would have gone down in history, I think, as being one of them. And this is probably perhaps the layers of Mandela's career which make him such an outsized figure. If he had been executed for the conspiracy, he would have gone down as one of those pioneering African nationalist leaders. He would have had a similar stature to them. He also would have had a similar stature, I think, to the likes of Mondlane in Mozambique and Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau in terms of leading that phase of the turn to arms struggle. So he's already wearing these two historical hats. If you read Frantz Fanon, he sort of does a typical typology of the road to liberation. In many respects, many things which are seen as being exceptional in the South African context are actually quite cliched. If you read Fanon, even before the South African stage is unfolded, he says you have this process of mass action where you've got the native bourgeoisie coming out, and then there's arrests, and then the struggle revolves around free X or Y, free Kenyatta or Ture or Hastings Banda. Mandela merely becomes the beneficiary of the largest ever one of those campaigns because he's arrested in an important country. You've got South Africa. In a sense, once the rest of the continent has been liberated, the focus of the world becomes on the South African situation. So whereas Kenyatta would have been vying for attention with Nkrumah or Hastings Banda or any one of these other leaders, it all becomes concentrated on South Africa and Mandela. So he becomes an even more outsized figure. And because he's incarcerated for so long, because the struggle lasts for so long, the campaign becomes more international. In a sense, he doesn't have to say anything particularly, he's not the greatest commander that Africa has seen. In other words, he's arrested before MK has really launched any operations in anger. But there are many factors of this international context, which by my reading of him, they're inflating him into a legend. And there's a possibility that once he's released after 27 years in Robben Island prison, and Polsmoor, of course, and Victor Verster, that he could be a disappointment, but then he's not a disappointment. But I think we also need to be specific as historians about what is important about what he does when he's released. If you read a book by Alistair Sparks, and this is not retrospective, this is around the time, he wrote a trilogy of books which deal with the South African transition, and one of them is called The Mind of South Africa, which was produced in the 1980s. And like Fanon, but in a different context, he sort of does a typical overview of the process of how these conflicts end. You've got Kenyatta being released. He becomes the great reconciler. All the whites say he's not as bad as we expected him to be, and this is actually quite positive. And then this is in Spark. He says the most remarkable, because he's writing in the late 1980s, he says the most remarkable is Robert Mugabe. Everybody was expecting him to be a radical militant, but he immediately came and he extended the olive branch of friendship. Do you see there is none of these struggles ended militarily, and none of the liberation struggles were able to march on Salisbury or Nairobi or wherever it was. They had to compromise, and they all compromised in the same way, using the same language of reconciliation. There's nothing remarkable there about Nelson Mandela as far as that is concerned. Take Namibia, for example, liberated just before 1990. Sam Nujoma comes back from exile, and they have the miracle, which is he starts speaking about reconciliation. Everybody says, oh, wow, we've avoided the blood, we've avoided the bloodbath which we were expecting. But in the sense, if none of these countries have a bloodbath, there's nothing really exceptional about it. It's sort of normal transition. And Mandela catalyzes that. So in many ways, it becomes, avatar is not the right word, but sort of an incarnation in a different sense of these typical African processes. But the historical circumstances, which I think in the South African case leads a sort of generic African nationalist, which is what Nelson Mandela becomes, to develop this sort of outsized persona. So I'm thinking aloud partly as I'm speaking here, but I'm trying to put him into perspective, and I'm trying to emphasize here that whilst he's sort of become this sort of phenomenal global icon, there's many senses in which the thing that he's become known as being unique for, there's nothing exceptional for them. They're sort of unique, they're sort of typical phases of decolonization, but it's the context that contributes to him becoming an outsized, iconic figure.
That is a very, very good answer. While you're doing some of your research, are there any kind of archival sources, or I listened to the lost. I'm doing air quotes for the listeners. Lost tapes. Stengel, who was his, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, his ghostwriter, and you listen to the tapes, and I loved those tapes. I know you mentioned everything there about the historical context, and I just can't help it that I as part of one of my biases, I'm a bit of a fan of Nelson Mandela, and you just and I think the personality just helped him become this kind of myth in his own time, legend in his own time. But was there any kind of archival material of the MK or Nelson Mandela that you think was maybe underrepresented or shed some new lights? I think your previous answer does put a lot of it into perspective, but any other thoughts on pieces of evidence and material that you found?
Sure. I mean, there's no limit to them in the sense that we were specifically privileged as researchers to enter into a sort of Wild West situation as far as the archives were concerned, which is we had one regime and one system of control of information, the apartheid regime having collapsed, the ANC stepping in, no particular incentive on their part to keep the old regime's secrets. You also had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process, which was a can opener where people basically confessed the worst thing they had done. So it's sort of out there. So you had a whole series of archives being opened. There was a sense that there's no real guardian of them. And there's huge, very interesting military intelligence documents which were opened to us as researchers, all sorts of oral history collections and projects where there was an attempt to sort of say that this was an underground struggle where records were not kept because, it's not a conventional bureaucratic struggle. So let's get interviews of people whilst they're still alive, and there's a huge amount of collections as far as that is concerned. It's just an incredibly rich, source-rich environment, which we've had the benefit of, protected by the fact that we have had a free constitution, which provides access to information, freedom of speech, and all the rest of it. So incredibly deep and rich repositories of interviews which have been deposited in the archives. And in that sort of circumstance, it almost fosters a spirit of openness in the following sense, which is that uniquely amongst liberation movements, the ANC opened its archives to public research. But that's a response to all of these allegations coming out by its ideological adversaries and its political adversaries, trying to expose the movement, and the ANC wanting to release its own records and have them out there in the public record. So there's a huge amount of archival creation and curation which took place in the 90s and 2000s, and a very large variety of sources which have been made available to us in the process.
It's so fascinating how much archival material has been made available, especially given how underground struggles like this often lack proper documentation. And with all the research that has come out, how do you see the effectiveness of MK in achieving its goals? Did it succeed in what it was set out to do?
In purely military terms of marching on Pretoria, they did not come close to doing that, and that was what has informed people to conclude that the armed struggle was therefore a failure. But I think what we've emphasized so far in our discussion is that when they asked for advice from people who they trusted to give them tips, they were consistently counseled towards a path of military moderation, the idea that armed struggle would have to dovetail with other forms of political struggle. So it really was an extension of politics by other means. And I think that if we look upon it as being a political instrument, there are many times and places in which it was incredibly valuable for them to be able to survive. Let's take one from the early 1960s, which is often overlooked. In the early 1960s, after the ANC's banned, it goes abroad under Oliver Tambo, and there's a formation which is called the African United Front. And one of the constituencies there is the Southwest African National Union, which is the Namibian equivalent of the ANC, and it really was the Namibian equivalent. But SWANU doesn't survive the exile experience. Why not? Because Independent Africa says that if we're going to recognize you as an organization, you have to launch an effective armed struggle. SWANU's never able to do that. SWAPO is. And that is really the reason why SWAPO rather than SWANU becomes the dominant factor there. You're not able to survive with the Organization of African Union unless you're waging an armed struggle. And if the Organization of African Union isn't going to recognize you, then the Soviet Union is not going to be interested in all of these other groups as well. United Nations, not interested if you don't have African support. So you can speak about the armed struggle in the 1960s as being limited and not really helping the ANC in any way. And there might have been, as many people say, better off doing non-violent protest in South Africa. Firstly, South Africa is a police state where the police people are demoralized in the 1960s. So there's not any clear pathway to power. It's not obvious that offering yourself to engage in those protests would have been an effective idea in the 1960s. It's a silent 60s as it's known. It's also not obvious that the ANC would have survived the exile experience in the 1960s, and it was difficult enough, even with the armed struggle, without the armed struggle itself. So as a political instrument, yes. And whilst people say, okay, some of these incursions were basically political gestures aimed at appeasing African opinion, and I would say, yes, that's exactly what they were. And in that regard, they were effective. If we go to the 1980s, okay, they're not marching on Pretoria, but they are using armed propaganda as a means of catalyzing mass protests. There is a cross-fertilization and an interpenetration of the two forms of struggle, because these non-violent demonstrations, I'm sort of putting air quotes as I say this, they're sort of waving replica AK-47s. They're doing the toy march, which they've learned from MK comrades. It's giving a militant edge to these protests. It's a very effective mechanism of getting bang for your buck. There's never more than 4,000 or so MK members abroad. They're not going to beat the 500,000 SADF troops. Their only shot is to use that limited military strength that they have to catalyze the insurrection. So the question there would be, with regards to success or failure, are they successful or are they not? I would say that they are successful in using that as an instrument to catalyze mass revolt. If we go to the early 90s, and I know it's becoming another long answer, so I'm not going to belabor it too much. People talk about peaceful negotiations. They're not peaceful. There's a deadly turf war between Inkatha and the ANC for control of the townships. And the quiet part, saying it out loud, is that the ANC wins that struggle for the townships. One of the reasons is that they completely destabilized the Inkatha Freedom Party through a process of targeted assassinations. People have this sort of hazy idea that there's a third force in Inkatha massacring innocent civilians and the lambs are being slaughtered by this crazy third force. There is a part of that. That's part of the violence. But then there's also the operations of MK hit squads, which are a very effective instrument in enabling the ANC to establish its sway on the townships, which becomes the backbone of the victory in the elections in 1994. People sometimes forget, and sometimes maybe it's good to have amnesia, that in that 1994 election campaigns, the international community was delighted to sign off on the South African problem. But there were huge problems of political intolerance there, no-go zones, people not being allowed to campaign, as far as that was concerned. So there's many ways and many campaigns that the ANC launches where MK is used as an instrument. Some it fails, some it's not successful, but some it is very successful. And once you get into that granular level of how it's extending politics by other means, then you have, I think, there needs to be a more nuanced view.
And within MK itself, how much internal conflict or infighting took place during this time? Were there any major divisions that shaped its trajectory?
Yeah, there's very serious infighting where in the late 1960s, there's a crisis in the camps in Tanzania, which leads to the Morogoro Conference. And then in the 1980s, there's a situation where 90% of the troops in Angola, which is where the ANC has its training camps abroad, are engaged in a mutiny against the organization, which leads to the Cowboy Conference. These are the two major conferences that the ANC has in exile. They're crisis conferences as a result of the difficulties within the organization. What are they about? They're ultimately about the same thing. The details change, the names and the sort of localized grievances, but the fundamental informing point is the same. The domino theory has come in for discredit in other contexts. I'm not going to speak about those other contexts, but in the Southern African context, it's absolutely determinative. There are factors which lead to South Africa being the last country to be liberated in the same way as the Portuguese colonies are the first. They are the ones who are first up against independent Africa. They're the first to face border wars. They have very long, porous borders, so Portugal is going to become the first. Once Portugal's empire collapses, Rhodesia's in an impossible situation faced with the full force, it becomes next. Only once you've broken into that redoubt, only once the dominoes have started to fall, do you start getting armed struggle on South Africa and Namibia's borders. So there is very much a domino effect which is at play, and that is in many respects determining what happens in the ANC's armed struggle. How that feeds into the camps is that the logistics are so difficult. It's very difficult to wage an armed struggle in South Africa because it's so expensive per operation to travel that distance from either Tanzania or Angola through hostile territory to reach South Africa. So if you're leaving South Africa to join uMkhonto weSizwe, leaving with this idea that you're going to get trained and you're going to return and fight, but you have to, the part which they don't tell you about is that you leave to get trained, and you must expect to spend many years in a training camp, not being able to use your military skills. If you do get launched on an infiltration, you're marching through extensive hostile territory, very high chance of being arrested or killed. Once you get into South Africa, how are you going to survive if there's not a sort of organized ANC underground to support you? So casualties are high as well. Those are the fundamental informing points. And if you're a person in the camp, if you left as a young person, you find yourself becoming a middle-aged person, either getting involved in Angola's civil war because they want, they want to give you something to keep you occupied, or alternatively spending year after year repeating training courses in the Angolan camps, facing problems with malaria, lousy food, and all the rest of it, it creates discontent. And that is what fuels the discontent ultimately in both cases.
I think there's a lot for us to learn about that day-to-day living and how that had an impact. And that's an interesting point. And I want to move on to, in fact, one of the MK fighters and leaders, commanders who was in exile, Hani. I remember when I was a kid, and this was, you mentioned that volatile moment in the early 90s. And of course, how would I realize, being 10 years old or whatever, I can't remember exactly, but somewhere there, 11, 12. And when Hani, who was an MK commander, and then I think at that point the leader of the Communist Party, when he was assassinated, and I just remember that, just from the news broadcast and all that, it was pretty tense. Were we going to, was the violence that was already prominent going to explode? And I remember Nelson Mandela coming on SABC 2 or 3 or whatever it was and saying, everyone keep calm. That's enough. And there was this thought, and maybe once again, like you were saying earlier, maybe it's myth making with hindsight, but there was a kind of feeling that this is the new leader of this country. This is the person that's going to take this country forward. I don't know if you can reflect on that, Thula.
So Chris Hani, he was assassinated in April 1993. I would say there has been a certain degree of romanticization about it. I mean, everybody speaks about Nelson Mandela having soothed the turbulent situation. But there was actually quite a degree of violence immediately after Chris Hani's death. And also, we have to remember that by the time we get to April 1993, the ANC and the National Party have gone through the sort of record of understanding, which is their pact where they get on the same page for the outcome of the negotiated settlement. And there have been multi-party negotiations initiated, and South Africa is on a clear path to a negotiated settlement. In fact, why are Clive Derby-Lewis and Janus Valus engaged in this desperate gambit of assassinations like their assassination of Chris Hani? They're doing that because they're seeing the writing on the wall that there has been this momentum achieved towards a negotiated settlement. Now, with regards to Chris Hani's assassination, it does establish him as a martyr, and the thing is that we don't know where he would have ended up. He would have had significant challenge from Thabo Mbeki, who eventually becomes the deputy president for Nelson Mandela. With regards to the idea some people have that he's the sort of lost prince, and that if he had been the person to take over, South Africa would not have gone in a neoliberal direction. That had been the case, firstly, there would have been there's reasons why the ANC decides that it cannot go full-fledged towards a socialist future, that it needs to compromise. And if Hani had taken an uncompromising perspective, then there would have been significant challenges as far as that is concerned. So many aspects that we don't know. I'm trying to speak here now as a sort of historian, trying to provide some sort of perspective about what the situation is at the time, and trying to counter or moderate some of the counterfactuals which are often produced as far as Chris Hani is concerned.
That is a really interesting point, how Hani's legacy became shaped by what people imagined might have happened rather than what we actually know. And given the political shifts happening at the time, another key figure we hear a lot about is Joe Slovo. Could you give us a few lines about his role during this period?
Yeah, before the ANC decides to authorize Nelson Mandela to form to uMkhonto, the South African Communist Party, exactly a year before, in December 1990, authorized the formation of armed units or groups who have received armed training who can form a nucleus of an armed struggle. And Joe Slovo is the person who is authorized to become the leader of the South African Communist Party's units. He's a World War II desert rat. In other words, he'd fought in the North African campaign, so he has military experience. And along with Jack Hodgson, his colleague, he's viewed as the person who has that experience. So he's actually a very prominent figure in the formation of uMkhonto, where he becomes Nelson Mandela's deputy when Mandela received the authorization to form uMkhonto, and he's often, along with his wife Ruth First, held up as the person who people will point to when they are looking for reasons as to why this should not be reduced to racial terms in terms of how the struggle is defined. So you have people after the 1976 Soweto uprising going into exile saying that they hate the white oppressors and they're imbued with black consciousness ideas, and they view it in racial terms to a large extent. They're moderated by the fact that they see many whites who interpret the struggle in the same way, and people like Joe Slovo, Ronnie Castrol's Ruth First, are principal among those. So he plays an important role in the development of the ANC's doctrine of multiracialism and non-racialism. And that becomes a very important mechanism in engineering a class perspective of the struggle, which is actually very useful, of course, for the South African Communist Party in terms of how it defined that struggle. But Joe Slovo, with his militancy, and especially in uMkhonto, where he also becomes the General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, when he steps down, Chris Hani steps in, and that's the position that he fills on his death in April 1993. So Slovo has a very important role. After 1994, he becomes the Minister of Housing in the new post-apartheid South African government, and so he's responsible above all for the iconic Hardy Reconstruction and Development Program houses, which are sort of the first attempt at solving the housing question as far as the post-apartheid government is concerned.
This content doesn't make itself, and we're fueled by cold beer and hot strategy. Buy us around at undergroundstrategy.com/support. It's how legends are made. Now back to it.
All these what have become larger than life figures that you've just put into some perspective over there and really well, Thula. I want to just kind of go back to what you were mentioning about early 90s. And this is, I recently spoke to someone on a project that I'm working at the moment, and I interviewed a MK fighter who was active in Natal, KwaZulu-Natal today. During that period, he was younger at the time, of course, and then integrated into the military. And so that's part of the research that I was doing. And he was saying to me how, looking at this integration period of the SANDF, and he said that even in the military, even though it was a bit low key, these fights between former MK fighters, now SANDF, and others from Natal, maybe more closely related to uMkhonto, would happen after hours occasionally, and they would have to separate them. So just like kind of an aside, that there were some small ripples going through. Max, some of the work that you were doing recently touches on what Thula mentioned also, right, about how the multiracialism of ANC and MK, and how they, some guys use inverted commas or air quotes whiteness to get the message out about Mandela, when some people thought he didn't know where he was.
Yeah, absolutely. And that ties into the work we're doing with Bob Newland on his biography, particularly in how the London recruits used their identities strategically to spread ANC messaging. And it's fascinating to look at how this played out, especially when people didn't know where Mandela was and how figures like Ronnie Casrills, etc., fit into that broader picture.
Yeah, and he worked closely with Ronnie Casrills, who you had mentioned, Thula. I'm thinking there's so much to discuss on in this topic, and in terms of the long-term impact and the reconciliation. Do you think that Nelson Mandela did have a key role in this, in terms of South Africa pre and then post 94?
I believe certainly that he plays an important role in engineering the historic compromises that enabled a negotiated settlement to be reached. He also plays an important role in the consolidation of ANC power, which I believe should be read as being something distinctive from an intention with the policy of reconciliation. What you'll find to the present day, there's a party called uMkhonto weSizwe, break off with the ANC, another one called the Economic Freedom Fighters. They view the historic compromises, the reconciliationary policy, as being the great negative turning point in modern South African history, where there was a compromise, a sellout, as they would use it in their terms. They view Nelson Mandela, that's their criticism which they make of him. They criticize the reconciliation policy as far as that is concerned. But that was also contested during Nelson Mandela's presidency. It was this idea that this is what we have to do in order to get a foothold on power, after which we can consolidate power further. It's also under Nelson Mandela that there's a breakaway from reconciliatory politics. There is the ANC walking out of the government of national unity. It's the extension of the policy of cadre deployment. There is the introduction of race-based transformation policies with regards to that being what the legacy of apartheid is defined as being and how it's to be addressed. It becomes the centerpiece of ANC policy. So there's a moment of reconciliation, but you see it being drawn down during the Nelson Mandela presidency. And he's enough of a disciplined ANC member to lead that process, to defend it and to advocate it. So I think, again, there has to be more nuance than people say. It's not just an unalloyed story of reconciliation under the Nelson Mandela presidency. A large part of that is pragmatic. This is what we need to do in order to have the opportunity to consolidate power and to transform the country in the way that we want.
And that comes out in his book or books, and also in the tapes, when you have those recordings where he says, my party have determined a role for me, a program of work, and I will lead that. He says it just in the way that you said it. So I'm not saying that he didn't have agency or whatever, but he clearly was part of that institution. I don't know if that's too strong to put it like that. it does resonate what you've said there, Thula.
I view it as being in many ways typical of a path that many struggles in Africa against white minority rule have followed. It's a very predictable trajectory in many ways, It's parallel, in every phase. There's that Rhodesia Zimbabwe moment, when it's no longer Rhodesia, Ian Smith has stepped aside. You've got Bishop Abel Muzorewa. There's this sort of coming together. And in the Namibian context, it's equivalent as the Southwest African Namibia moment, where they're sort of hyphenated between the two. There's a sort of period of minority rule that can no longer be sustained in every single case. Political scientists would be able to draw, as Fanon and Alistair Sparks did. Every single case, the transition is from minority rule to a form of power sharing. Power sharing doesn't work because it gives whites too much influence and authority. It sort of phases into a period of reconciliation. Mugabe is as much a reconciler for a long period. And, we're talking when Alistair Sparks wrote 10 years after the fall of Rhodesia, and then it becomes majoritarianism. There's a sort of phased process, which I think that if somebody would have, the sort of sufficient pragmatism to just follow the facts and look for structure and pattern to see that there is a trajectory which South Africa follows too. And I think that more complex, nuanced reading would be necessary in terms of understanding Mandela's impact.
I think the way you've laid it out there, it totally makes sense. And I suppose while the political scientists and others will find those trends and so on, often, as you well know, as a historian and the fans of history, they want the great men and women of history, right? And it suited a narrative. And I feel sometimes that personality and Nelson Mandela was creating a narrative and a very, very good one at that, for the specific context.
Well, yeah, no, the great. What I would say, trying to get out, you sort of getting me to think on my feet a bit. What I would say is that a sort of place has been created in the struggle for a great man to emerge. And I would actually say that if it hadn't been Mandela, somebody else would have stepped into these positions. It could have been different figures at different times, but there was a place for a great man along that specific pattern to emerge. We know this because in other struggles, an identical great man has stepped in with the same Madiba militancy, Madiba magic, Madiba great statesman afterwards, pattern. You see him in Kenyatta and Mugabe and in Sam Nujoma and in various other African post-colonial leaders ad infinitum, Amilcar Cabral, Eduardo Mondlane. What's unique about Mandela is that he sort of becomes an incarnation of all of these in one.
Yeah, I think that's what you mentioned is interesting about being a combination of so many different figures. Yeah, I think that personality, he the celebrity that came with it, going on tour when he went out of jail, from Cuba to the New York Yankees and appearing on these talk shows, and he became a celebrity. And for me, at least with hindsight, you think, yeah, he was playing for the crowd in some ways. He had to.
And doing his job as a disciplined ANC member as well. Yes, I would add that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And he made no, he was pretty honest about that always, that was his role. I'm keen to just explore more on a different episode, perhaps how the MK and ANC came to the fore, of the United Democratic Front. And it wasn't a certainty that the ANC would have been the party towards the late 80s and then the 90s.
I think they've prepared a lot of groundwork. I think that their position is more secure than it was in the immediate aftermath of the banning. I think there's been a slow accumulation of ANC influence in the late 1970s. And in the early 1980s, from 1981, you sort of see even people like Desmond Tutu wielding the black, green, and gold, which are the ANC's colors. I think there's been a long period of armed propaganda, mobilization of the masses, the ANC's having secured the external front in terms of international support as well. So I actually think that, whilst some people say if only there's a lost opportunity in the 1980s for a different kind of politics, I think that politics would have found it very difficult to escape falling under ANC hegemony and suzerainty.
Mentioning Desmond Tutu, I'm not sure if he was ever a fully fledged member, but there was a spat with him and Thabo Mbeki, right? And maybe some other people also. about who had done what. And I mean, maybe not a conversation for now. I think definitely a big figure. Thula, we want to thank you so much for joining us today and giving us really a very detailed and tremendous class on the MK, Nelson Mandela, and also Southern African history. It's really been a pleasure to have you with us.
Likewise, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to hearing and seeing the interview and the rest of the proceeds of this project.
Do you maybe just want to say a word or two about your books? We'll add them into the show notes, just before we hand over to Max for the closing.
Yeah, no, I'm Thula Simpson, Associate Professor at the University of Pretoria. My books are uMkhonto, weSizwe, the ANC's Armed Struggle, published in 2016, and then also History of South Africa from 1902 to the present, published in 2021, and also a couple of edited books as well, ANC and the Liberation Struggle, Essential Writings, which is 2017, and then there's History Beyond Apartheid, New Approaches in South African Historiography, which is 2023, and later this year it's going to be another edited book, which is The Routledge Companion to Post-Colonial African Historiography.
Wow, a busy man indeed. Thank you so much, Max. Last words to you as always.
Thank you so much, Thula. As Tony said, this has been a real masterclass. I've learned a ton about MK and Mandela, and I know our listeners will feel the same. And I really appreciate you coming on, and I'll definitely be diving into your books to learn even more. Thank you to everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week. Bye-bye for now.